Often described as the backbone to the hospitality industry, this week we take a look at those waiters and the waitrons that carry this very important task of the economy. However, we question what their working conditions are and, in particular, how they are covered by COIDA. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them?
Welcome to Workers' World Show. I'm your host, Sharik Trubodi. Thank you once again for having joined us. Of course, we continue our series of programs focusing particularly on COIDA and the workers that are meant to fall under that level of protection. And so today we draw attention to the issues facing workers in the hospitality sector. While restaurant work marks some sort of a rite of passage into the world of work for young part-time workers, it is not without its difficulties for many young workers. Restaurant patrons often pass heavy judgment on incompetent waiters by paying low tips or none at all. For many workers, these jobs support entire families as it is their only source of income. Couple this with the compensation from employees for long and tiring hours, as well as to discover that it is one of the harshest working industries to work in. And so, in today's show, we put the situation of restaurant workers under the microscope, and in particular concerning their employment conditions, as well as the occupational health and safety. We have a panel of guests that's going to be joining us very shortly. We have Memetle Sibai, the president of the General Industries Workers Union of South Africa, including Mike Sikane, the National Education Coordinator for the South African Catering, Commercial and Allied Workers Union. All right, and so we continue this conversation, particularly around those workers that are facing quite a tough time in the hospitality sector. And of course, our guest, Dr. Vusi Nkleba, who's epidemiology and surveillance sector, particularly with the National Institute for Occupational Health, is also joining us today. And so let's welcome our guest. And I want to start off with Mr. Sibai, the president of the General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa. Thank you, sir, for having joined us. Perhaps if we could start off by establishing what is the general consensus at the moment about the working environment for those that work within the hospitality sector, particularly those waiters.
It is terrible. I think that's the only way you can characterize it. It is terrible. It's tragic because this is one sector that has seen not only lack of advance in terms of rights, but actually it has been rolled back. The issue, particularly of the weaponization of the disparate migrant workers by the industry, is part of that story. These are workers that are employed under horrific conditions without basic conditions of employment. So let me just give you examples to illustrate that. Many of these workers are actually employed without a basic salary. They are employed without a basic contract that outlined the security of their employment. Basically, you have to be very optimistic even to take a lunch box to work because you might not have a work by lunchtime. These are workers who, because they are paid, if you like, through tips, meaning basically employer has no obligation over them except for the clients. The employer, therefore, does not pay any of the statutory protections that are in place. There's no insurance against unemployment in a form of UIF. There is no insurance in case of injury and disease, and all of that because these are workers that effectively they are being outsourced as a responsibility not of the employer, but of the responsibility of the clients. And that also, by the way, makes them much more vulnerable to abuse. How do you protest against abusive client when it is that client who directly, immediately pay your salary and responsible for whether you leave that work that day with something to even transport you home, otherwise you want. But also, I
Yeah,
mean, these are
I want
workers
to talk
that,
about
for
that
the
as
most
well,
part, are
particularly the recent mood in the country targeting restaurants to, of course, ascertain whether the workers there are here legally in South Africa, together with the working permits that they meant to carry. So I want to come to that and some of the other examples suggested, but let's just welcome Mike into the discussion. Mike, in what general legal framework are these waiters employed? Are they part-time workers? Are they casuals? Do they have permanent contracts? Are they in possession of any contract, as it were? Can you sketch for us the legal background to how most workers are employed within the sector?
Good morning, everyone. The prevalent cases are that of these workers are employed in an atypical form of employment. The piece of paper that you might read as a contract, it is worthless when you compare it maybe to the quality and the value of what is contained in the paper, but also the standard of employment is very complex. For a very long time, the sector was allowed to rake in volumes of what we may say it's labor brokerage practices. In that, we mean that even the employer organizations, instead of helping the very sector to create direct employment, these employer organizations are agencies to complicate the relationship that's supposed to be smooth between the restaurant operator and the employed person.
Can I ask whether
And
you
that cuts
are
across.
are you referring directly to labor brokers, and are labor brokers still quite widely used in this industry?
Very much so. Even if you take an employer to CCMA in this sector, in most of the time, you do not deal with the employer directly. You deal with labor brokers who supplied the labor to the employer and who many a times would not be briefed or appraised of the contents of the dispute and what have you. So the employment standards are very poor.
Okay. I want to just quickly bring in Dr. Vusi to the discussion regarding whether those labor brokers that are being used and the fact that there's a high casualization of the sector, as it were, whether that is as a consequence of restaurant operators or the owners of these restaurants, that it is them that determine what is largely a pattern that exists within this industry of casualization, no contracts, very little benefits, if at all, etc. Where does that come from? Is it largely the restaurant owners?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the question, and good morning to everyone. First, I must mention that I'm from the National Institute for Occupational Health, which is under the National Health Laboratory Service. So our mandate really is to help out and do research, see if occupational health is adhered to or followed. So to answer your question on petrol attendants, ours was to see their health and how they are affected by the work that they do. Not necessarily into, we don't know at the moment. As I said, it's an ongoing study. At the moment, we don't know whether, well, we know that the ones that we're dealing with, that we're interviewing, are permanently employed. So I wouldn't know about those that are not.
Okay, and I'll then come back to some of the conditions that they work under, and particularly how from an Institute for Occupational Health, how this impacts certainly the industry as it were. We are talking at this time around the working conditions for those within the hospitality sector, in particular those restaurant workers. And already we've begun to establish that there are indeed some very serious problems, some of which extend to the legal vehicle under which they are employed, but also those conditions that I want to get a little bit more deeper into once we do return from the break. This is Workers' World. Do stay with us. We are talking about restaurant workers in particular and what sort of coverage they have, particularly on occupational health and safety, and COIDA, the other act that we are referring to in this part of our program today. Of course, we have established that there is still a high prevalence of particularly workers that are being used by labor brokers as a concern, as well as the contracts under which sometimes they do not even have to be employed in the restaurants. I'd like to welcome at this time Ashraf Redcliffe to the program. He's the Monitor and Training Manager on Occupational Health and Safety. And Ashraf, thanks very much for having joined us. Maybe just to start off with unpacking in what way occupational health and safety does in fact apply to these workers, and whether there is a high prevalence of actual adherence to the legislation.
Well, thank you for that, Shariq. Just to quickly link up with the previous contributors, they've described working conditions that seems unfavorable and obviously unacceptable from basic workers' rights point of view, and that could have direct implications as well for the occupational health and safety conditions that is applicable and the enjoyment of the rights that workers have around health and safety. Just specifically to the conditions around health and safety, some of the conditions includes slips and trips, when people fall under surfaces that might be wet and so on and greasy, given particularly the sort of restaurant conditions in the kitchens. There's hot surfaces and burns that they could potentially suffer, given the equipment they use to prepare food or any other services they provide to the clients. There's sharp objects, there could be knives, slicers, and other sharp tools that they use, or some equipment that might not be well maintained and therefore have sharp surfaces or sharp edges. And then manual handling might involve having to lift very heavy items. That's clearly an issue with regard to ergonomics and how that might affect them. So that's generally within the category of physical hazards. There's also chemical hazards. I'm not going to go into details. It includes cleaning chemicals, pesticides, and insecticides. We've just recently also had cases of young people being exposed to, pesticides and health effects and deaths and so on. There's biological hazards, so they could be affected by any biological aspect that is coming with the food, the ingredients that is made with the food and so on, which they could be affected and could lead to occupational diseases. And I've already mentioned the ergonomic hazards of repetitive movements, lifting heavy items. And then just broadly, I think what the colleagues described earlier, Mike and so on, involves the psychosocial hazards. There might be a lot of stressful situation. If you're not earning enough and you can't cover all of your expenses, you might find that you're under pressure, and if there's only tips that you sort of rely on for part of your income, then that could contribute to significant challenges as well. I'll stop there.
I wanted to
specific
come in there, in fact, and ask you just a quick summary before I move on
people working in the restaurants.
to Mr. Sibai. I just wanted to understand whether from all of those areas that you've covered, what is the most prevalent occupational hazard or disease that is contracted for this segment of workers?
I mean, Ashraf has described, I think, quite eloquently and competently, as a researcher, obviously, about the health hazard that they face, and all of that, basically. But here's the problem from our point of view as a workers' movement, that many of these workers, not only because they are stripped of their rights, in a situation wherein the industry is exploiting the most vulnerable workers whose very status in the country is being complicated by an increasingly xenophobic laws and restrictive policies, right, on migration. On the other hand, it is also the fact that they are unable to report these, incidences, for a number of reasons. Let's take an example. In most of these restaurants, when you break something, you are likely to pay for it. So a worker is not likely to report slipping and falling and injury emanating from that, because most likely, something was broken in the course of the slip up. And the reality then is that for the fear of deductions from that incident, the worker will just suffer in silence. But also when it comes to, most of the chemical-induced, like injuries or diseases or illnesses, you end up with most of this progressing over time. So a worker is most likely to feel the impacts, the health impacts of chemicals over a period of 3-4 years. And with the level of casualization that we have, by that time the worker is most likely at work, at home, and no longer employed in that restaurant because of the short-term, highly casualized nature of employment, and the end result of which is that they never get compensation for injury, for illness, for those reasons. Those are just practical problems that we do have. Of course, linked with a low level of unionization that corresponds with the level of casual workers and the level of casualization, as well as other complications of organizing this sector of the workers, alongside poor inspection, enforcement, and monitoring on the part of department, but also a lack of access of trade unions to many of these workplaces.
And when I come to some of those very examples that you've cited, but Mr. Sikari, before I have to go for a break very quickly, the problems that we're seeing at the moment within the hospitality sector, is it because there isn't sufficient monitoring, be it by the Department of Labor or even Department of Health when it comes to, Ashraf spoke about the pesticides and insecticides, etc., exposure there too. But the fact that we sit with these sorts of problems, is it because there's a lack of monitoring taking place at the moment?
Yes, for this business to strive, they have to lower the standards to an abnormal level. But you also can't find a reason as to why would the state allow these practices to continue for so long. For these employers, some of them, or mainly all of them, are properly registered. But when it comes to beneficiation of workers and provision of safety equipment for workers, then they decide not to comply, or they know of the low levels of inspectorate as well as pure monitoring in all instances. But I want also to say the other source of the problem is the lack of training, especially on issues of COIDA and or occupational health. There is virtually no training that is prioritized in these spaces, especially on areas where there are hazardous zones. Because in the list that the researcher have placed there, there is this space of cold rooms, which lead to people in the long run to contract TB or any other diseases that are related
to exactly that I want to get into, because I want to, when we return from the break, try and establish whether the compensation fund has had applications from this industry and whether that process has been smooth or not. We'll come back to all of that and more in just a bit. This is Workers' World. It is the hospitality sector that is under the microscope here today, particularly looking at the working conditions of those waiters and waitrons, but more importantly, whether the legislative processes that are in place to protect those workers, whether they are in fact being applied, and we're observing that application here today. Ashraf, maybe just to, because we are in our last segment, of course, just to look at the compensation fund that COIDA so does allow, which of course is occupational health, injuries and diseases within the workplace. We heard Mike before the break highlight the fact that there are certain diseases that are contracted within the workplace, etc., as well as the injuries that I think is almost synonymous with this particular sector. What is the status or the observation regarding COIDA and whether it is being applied and the way within which it is being applied?
Thank you, Tashrik. We can't speak on behalf of the Compensation Fund, as we are essentially a national public health institute looking at occupational health, providing services and research. But specifically with regard to the Compensation Fund, clearly it's a no-fault insurance that is run by the state. It takes insurance premiums from the employers based on their risk ratings, and it then provides certain benefits to employees after the fact, after they've been injured, after they've become sick, or after they may have died at work. And those benefits are spelled out in the Compensation for Occupational Injuries Diseases Act, the COIDA Act. I think just to link that question, Tashrik, to a point made earlier about monitoring, I think it's important for my colleagues, and I'm sure they'll support this from their experience, to know that there is a monitoring function that our shop stewards, that they have part of the organizations play, and there's also a monitoring function by the health and safety representatives. And that links up to the training point that Mike raised towards the end, that capacity needs to be built for people to be able to use their rights in law. It's in the Labor Relations Act, it is in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and in the COIDA Act, the Compensation Act, where they do have rights to monitor and support and assist workers. But an additional point which is critical, I think, that neither COIDA needs to look at, and as well as worker representative organizations like advice officers and the unions, is what occupational health services, what occupational health clinics is being provided, particularly by the public sector, if not by the private sector and the employers, and how, for example, even perhaps the National Health Insurance, the NHI, can contribute and fund those sort of services so that the problems described by Mike and his colleague will be addressed so that workers are not as vulnerable as they are. And that includes, obviously, foreign nationals who are regarded as employees and if they are documented. Thanks, Ashrik.
And I didn't quite have the time to really go there, but let's pick up on that very quickly with you, Mr. Sikane. The focus here on the industry by the Department of Labor in the recent times to particularly look for migrants that do not have the necessary paperwork. This has been what some have described in the industry, the targeting of restaurants. How do you see what's happening at the moment? Mrs. Khan, I think your mic may be muted. You
Okay,
just unmute
no,
yourself.
thanks. No, I'm saying it was long overdue, and it came and in a low percentage. And in that low percentage, it impacted very few establishments. And it is our view that that intervention ought to be sustained and be reported properly so that follow-ups and follow-through are done in a frequent manner. And also the target should not be one side of the city. It should be a season where we target all operating businesses across the city so that we have a data of each city in South Africa that we can refer to so that we may know how to move forward. Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Sibai, so there are injuries, there are diseases. We spoke about the high casualization in the sector. There's often not many contracts that exist. Whether or not this is often monitored by the Department of Labor is not entirely certain. But let's try and mix all of that together and look at what is the common practice, the employment practice within this industry at the moment, and how can we get workers to benefit, not just from BCEA, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, but also, complementary acts such as COIDA and so on. So how do we move the needle in the level of compliance and monitoring that needs to take place?
I think Ashraf has provided some of the basis, right? You need many levels of enforcement and compliance. One is that you need compliance from a health and safety perspective, as a labor matter. That's one. Two, there is also health inspections that need to be conducted, particularly to protect public, but also the staff themselves, because they do suffer from this, right? Most part, although they're not even allowed in most instances to consume, like to eat food in those very restaurants, the reality is that they do, given that most of them don't even have, income that is stable, reliable, and can be, dependent upon. So many of these workers are even made to buy their own uniform So the idea that, for instance, they are going to buy their own PPEs is not realistic. We need to establish clear standards where one compulse. I mean, there's a very clear standards in terms of ensuring that those workers are permanently employed, they are secure in their employment, and where these workers are actually migrants, they are being assisted to be regularized, to be documented, because the worst thing that the labor movement can do in this respect is to allow a segment of the working class to be stripped of their rights. Apartheid was about this. It was about disenfranchisement of the black working class precisely so that they can be ruthlessly exploited for capital accumulation and profiteering. What we need above all, not to have just a blind faith of the state, because the state is pursuing its own agenda. What we are saying by way of this rate is not addressing the underlying problem, it's just to further basically dividing the working class on a very sensitive issue that the capitalist class has weaponized of migration and, of course, xenophobia and so on. What therefore we need is an access, but also unionization of these workers. So the workers' movement must develop its own program over and above demanding of Department of Labor to ensure that they enforce the regulations, they enforce the rules. Health authorities also do inspections, make sure that the food is both safe and healthy for public, but also for these workers, as well as the conditions in which it's prepared. It must be healthy and safe. It must be healthy and safe for both workers and, again, as I said, public. At the same time, we need to demand an access, whether those workers belong to our unions or not. There must be a framework for access of unions to ensure that they enforce.
You're right. The fact that there isn't a high representation, probably also because these workers oftentimes do not have proper employment contracts, and so lots of work to cover on that front. I want to thank you for tuning in once again as we continue our series on COIDA this week, having taken a look at the hospitality industry, and more so in particular the waiters that serve is the backbone of this particular industry. We continue the series next week. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.